The biting wind was a constant companion in Redemption Creek, a town that offered little of its namesake. Alara pulled the thin shawl tighter around her shoulders, the fabric offering scant protection against the late autumn chill that seeped into bone. Her hands, raw and chapped, clenched the worn leather of her satchel. Inside, a few meager belongings. Outside, the vast, unforgiving landscape stretched towards a horizon as bleak as her own prospects. She was adrift, a widow cast out by circumstance and cruel gossip, left with nothing but her own 2 feet and a desperate need for shelter and a crust of bread. Mr. Silas Blackwood's offer, delivered via the reluctant town elder, was less a job and more a lifeline flung from a sinking ship. He needed a cleaner for his isolated, sprawling house on the edge of town, the place folks whispered about, where grief had supposedly curdled into something unsettling. It was a job no one else would take, the pay meager, the circumstances dubious. But for Alara it was survival. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage of fear and exhaustion. She was tired of the stares, the hushed judgments, the gnawing emptiness left by Thomas's absence. The house loomed ahead now, silhouetted against the bruised twilight sky. It wasn't decrepit, not yet, but it sagged under a visible weight of neglect, like a man hunched under an unbearable burden. Smoke didn't curl from its chimney. No light spilled from its windows. It was a monument to solitude. She lifted her hand, hesitant, to the heavy oak door. The wood was rough beneath her trembling fingers. This was it. The last chance, perhaps. If this failed. She didn't let herself finish the thought. She knocked, a small, tentative sound swallowed by the wind. Silence answered. She knocked again, louder this time, putting all her dwindling courage into the rap. A moment stretched, long and thin as a breaking thread. Then the sound of a bolt being drawn back, slow and deliberate. The door creaked open just enough to reveal a sliver of darkness and the man who stood within. Silas Blackwood. He was a tall man, stooped slightly, as if perpetually bracing against a gale. His face was obscured by shadow, but she felt the weight of his gaze upon her. It wasn't unkind, but it was utterly empty, devoid of welcome or curiosity, just vacant. His clothes were clean but worn, functional. He smelled faintly of pipe tobacco and dust. "You're the woman." His voice was a low rumble, rough and used. Alara Hayes," she managed. Her voice thin despite her effort to make it steady. He didn't nod, didn't move. The silence stretched again, thick with unspoken histories and present desolation. "Come in, then," he said finally, pushing the door open wider. The air inside was cold, heavy, smelling of stale air, disuse, and that pervasive dust. It settled on everything, furniture draped in sheets, surfaces thick with gray fuzz, the very air particles dancing in the weak light filtering through grimy windows. It was the air of a place that had been holding its breath for a very long time. Alara stepped across the threshold, the door closing behind her with a definitive thud that echoed in the silent house. She felt a prickle of unease, isolated here with a man known only by rumor and sorrow. But underneath the unease, a different feeling stirred, a strange kinship with this house and its occupant. Both were wounded, neglected, trying to hold themselves together against the relentless erosion of time and pain. "The job," Silas said, his back to her as he moved towards a darker part of the house. "Cleaning. Everything. It's been." Neglected was an understatement. It was a house frozen in time, the life drained out of it, leaving only the shell. He didn't ask about her situation, her journey, her needs. It was a purely transactional arrangement. He needed a problem solved, the dust, the decay. She needed survival. Anything beyond that felt impossible in the oppressive silence. She looked around, her eyes adjusting to the gloom. The sheer scale of the task was daunting. Where did one even begin to scrub away years of layered grief? But as daunting as it was also a focus, a physical act that demanded her attention, pulling her away from the abyss of her own despair. "I understand, Mr. Blackwood," she said, her voice finding a little more strength. "I'll start tomorrow," he turned, his eyes catching a sliver of light from the dirty window. For a fleeting instant, she saw something flicker there, not sorrow, not anger, but a profound, bone-deep weariness. He simply nodded and motioned vaguely towards a back room. "There's a room. You can stay. Food. Simple fare. I'll provide." It wasn't charity. It was part of the arrangement, practical and unadorned. Alara felt a knot in her chest loosen, just slightly. A roof, food, a chance. It was a fragile beginning in a place where hope felt like a forgotten relic. She was a ghost in a ghost house, hired to bring order to another's chaos while her own heart remained a wreck. The days blurred into a rhythm of work, quiet and solitary. Alara started in one corner of the house and worked her way relentlessly through it, room by room, surface by surface. The dust was stubborn, ingrained, a physical manifestation of time left to stand still. She found simple tools, rags, brushes, a bucket, and set about her task with a quiet ferocity that surprised even herself. Scrubbing, sweeping, airing out rooms that hadn't seen sunlight in years. The sheer physical labor was a balm, dulling the sharper edges of her grief and anxiety. As she cleaned, she uncovered traces of the life lived here before the silence. A child's drawing tucked behind a bookshelf, a woman's embroidered sampler folded neatly in a drawer, photographs tucked away in an album, smiling faces, vibrant moments frozen in time. These discoveries were poignant, hinting at the depth of the loss that had brought the house and its owner to this state. She didn't pry, didn't linger over them. They were simply things to be dusted, moved, and put back. Silas moved through the house like a shadow. He spent most of his days in a study, or sometimes just sitting by a cold hearth, staring into the empty grate. Their interactions were minimal, quiet acknowledgments, simple instructions about supplies. He didn't supervise her work, didn't seem to care how she did it, only that it was being done. He ate sparingly, alone, and retired early. His presence was a quiet weight in the house, heavy with unexpressed pain. One afternoon, Alara was cleaning the parlor. She was dusting a small table by the window when her hand brushed against a small, leather-bound book. It wasn't a book, she realized, but a journal. Fell open to a page with faded ink. A woman's elegant script. Alara froze, a sense of intrusion washing over her. This was private. This was hers. She quickly closed the journal, her heart beating faster. As she reached to put it back, Silas appeared in the doorway, silent as ever. He didn't look at her, his gaze fixed on the table. "That was Martha's," he said, his voice soft, almost a whisper, utterly different from his usual rough tone. Martha, his wife, the woman in the photographs, the embroiderer, the mother of the child in the drawing. Alara held the journal out to him, but he made no move to take it. She wrote in it every day," he continued, his eyes still distant. "About the garden, the weather, small things." He paused, a long, drawn-out silence that seemed to stretch across the years. After she was gone, I couldn't bear to touch it, or anything." Alara waited, saying nothing. There was nothing she could say that wouldn't feel clumsy or hollow. He finally looked at her, his eyes meeting hers for the first time with something other than vacant neutrality. There was a flicker of vulnerability, quickly masked. "Just put it back," he said, his voice returning to its low register. She nodded, carefully placing the journal back on the table. It was a small moment but significant. A tiny crack in the wall he had built around himself. It changed something, shifted the dynamic from employer and employee to two people acknowledging, however subtly, the shared landscape of loss. The dust seemed a little less heavy that day. The silence in the house felt less like an absence and more like a shared, quiet space. Alara continued her work, her movements perhaps a little gentler now around the objects that held echoes of Martha's life. She was just the cleaner, hired for a task, but in uncovering the house, she was also uncovering the remnants of a life, and the raw wound it had left behind. And in that quiet uncovering, a tentative bridge began to form across the chasm of two solitary sorrows. Winter tightened its grip on Redemption Creek, painting the world in shades of gray and white. The wind howled like a hungry wolf around the isolated house. Inside, Alara's work had transformed the space. It wasn't just clean. It felt breathable again. Sunlight, no longer filtered through layers of grime, streamed into the rooms, illuminating faded wallpapers and the warm tones of polished wood. The scent of dust had been replaced by the faint, clean smell of lye soap and fresh air whenever she dared open a window. Silas still spent much time in silence, but his movements were less haunted. He no longer ate alone in the vast, empty dining room, but would sometimes take his simple meals at the smaller table in the newly cleaned kitchen, where Alara worked. They didn't converse much, but the silence was different now, companionable, not oppressive. He watched her sometimes, his gaze no longer vacant but observant. He noticed the small touches, a faded quilt folded neatly, a wilting houseplant given water and sunlight. He didn't comment, but Alara felt the weight of his quiet appreciation. The external threat materialized not as a person, but as the unforgiving season. A fierce blizzard descended, cutting the house off from town completely. Supplies dwindled faster than anticipated. Doubt and fear gnawed at Alara. She was trapped here, reliant on a man who was still largely a mystery. But the storm, while isolating, also forced them into a shared reality. They needed to check the woodpile, secure the shutters, manage their meager resources together. Silas, despite his quiet nature, was capable and practical. He moved with an economy of motion born of years living in this harsh environment. He didn't voice concern, but his actions showed he was aware of the predicament. One evening, huddled by the newly lit hearth, Alara had finally tackled the fireplace. Finding its long dormant heart, Silas looked at her. The firelight danced in his eyes, making them seem less hollow. "We're low on flour," he stated simply. It wasn't an accusation, just a fact. Alara felt a prickle of anxiety. "I know," she replied softly. "We'll manage." He didn't respond immediately, his gaze fixed on the flames. Then he spoke, his voice low. "Martha used to make a stew, with dried apples and potatoes. Kept well." It was another shard of memory offered, tentative, fragile. Alara felt a warmth spread through her, something other than the fire's heat. He was sharing. "I know how to make stew," she said, meeting his gaze. "If we have the ingredients." They pooled what they had: potatoes, onions, a few dried apples from the root cellar Alara had cleaned, some aging jerky. As Alara prepared the stew, Silas sat nearby, sharpening a knife, his presence a silent anchor. The simple act of preparing food together in the face of the storm, sharing the warmth of the fire, felt profound. It wasn't just about sustenance. It was about survival, yes, but also about finding comfort and solidarity in shared adversity. Alara realized she wasn't just cleaning his house. She was helping to rebuild a home, brick by invisible brick, out of the ruins of their shared isolation. Her own fear began to recede, replaced by a quiet determination. She wasn't the helpless widow anymore. She was a woman with purpose, with a task, and with an unexpected companion in the storm. The storm passed, leaving behind a world transformed by snow, stark and beautiful. The isolation lingered for days, but the house no longer felt like a prison. The shared ordeal of the blizzard had cemented the unspoken bond between Alara and Silas. The simple stew had tasted like hope. As the drifts began to settle and a path was eventually cleared to town, the practical matters resurfaced. Supplies were needed, and there was the matter of Alara's future. The cleaning job was essentially done. The house gleamed with a quiet dignity it hadn't possessed in years. Alara had not only swept away the dust but also the suffocating atmosphere of stagnant grief. One afternoon, Silas found her packing her few things. He stood in the doorway, that familiar silent presence, but now it felt less like a wall and more like a steadying weight. "Leaving?" he asked, his voice quiet. Alara turned, her hands still. "The work is finished, Mr. Blackwood," she said softly. "The house is clean." It was the truth, but it felt inadequate. Where would she go? Back to Redemption Creek? The thought was heavy with dread. Silas stepped into the room. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and she saw the depth of his blue eyes, the lines etched by sorrow and solitude, and something else now, a flicker of vulnerability that mirrored her own. "The house is clean," he agreed, his gaze sweeping around the small, tidy room she had made her own. "But it's quiet again." Too quiet, he hesitated, choosing his words with care, a man unused to speaking the language of need. "The work. It wasn't just the cleaning, was it?" He didn't phrase it as a question, but a statement, a recognition of the intangible change she had wrought. He looked away then, towards the window, his reflection faint against the snowy landscape. "I hired you to clean my house," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But maybe I just needed someone to be here." Alara's breath caught in her throat. The raw honesty, the simple admission, disarmed her completely. All the unspoken loneliness she carried, all the fear of being truly alone again, found an echo in his quiet words. It wasn't a declaration of love, not in the grand romantic sense, but something perhaps more fundamental, more necessary, the acknowledgement of a shared human need for connection, for presence, in the face of overwhelming loss. He turned back to her, his expression open for the first time. "Stay, Alara," he said, his voice gaining a little strength. "Not as the cleaner, but stay." The offer wasn't a contractual agreement. It was an invitation, fragile and hopeful, extended from one solitary soul to another. Alara looked at the worn satchel in her hands, then at Silas, standing there in the quiet, sunlit room. The harsh world outside still existed. The future was still uncertain. But here, in this house that had been a tomb of grief, a fragile sprout of possibility was pushing through the frozen earth. She thought of Thomas, of the love they had shared, gone but not forgotten. It had left a wound, but also a capacity for connection. Silas, too, carried his wound, a different shape but equally deep. Perhaps healing wasn't about forgetting, but about finding new ways to live alongside the scars. Together, she placed the satchel gently back on the floor. A sense of peace, quiet and profound, settled over her. "Okay, Silas," she said, her voice steady, clear. "I'll stay." It wasn't just about a roof over her head anymore. It was about building something new, fragile but real, from the remnants of two broken lives. They had both hired and been hired for different things, but what they found, in the quiet work and the shared silence, was the indispensable necessity of not facing the emptiness alone. The house was clean, yes, but more importantly, it was beginning to feel like a home again.